You were a married man who had a 2-year affair with your wife's stepsister, but Miss Richmond claims you are not her daughter's biological father. Your other daughter, Lakeisha, is here to support your claim. Positive. The plaintiff is not your daughter's biological father, and
not thinking, just being wild at that time of my age.
I mean, you a married man, and it's bad enough you sleeping around outside the marriage.
That was an honest mistake, Your Honor.
How long did this mistake?
It lasted, I'd say, about 2 years. Yeah, I know a year. Yes.
Regularly?
Yes.
Often, very often.
Without protection?
Without protection.
Could develop.
Because he was taking me home from when I used to go over to their house to visit my stepsister and stuff.
So you all had known each other for an extended amount of time?
I thought what I thought was love back in that time. I think that's why I chose to tell him first before anyone else that he was the father. We slept together more. As I remember, he said yes right off. He came over to my house and he picked her up.
The courtroom was quiet, but the tension was heavy long before anyone spoke. Years of silence, regret, and unanswered questions had brought these people together. Mr. Griffin sat on one side, carrying the weight of a secret he had lived with for decades. Across from him stood TAA, a woman who had grown up without a father's name, without a clear sense of where she came from, and without the truth that could have anchored her life. Between them was a story that began long before either of them could understand its consequences. More than 30 years earlier, Mr. Griffin was a married man. He had been married for nearly a decade when he made a decision that would ripple through multiple families. He entered into a relationship with his wife's stepsister, Miss Richmond. It was not a brief mistake or a single lapse in judgment. It was a secret affair that lasted almost 2 years. They saw each other often, and they admitted to being intimate regularly. There was no protection, no real consideration of the consequences, only the reckless emotions of two people who admitted they were not thinking about anyone else at the time. Miss Richmond later became pregnant. She says that during that period, Mr. Griffin was the man she was with most. She also admitted that she had been intimate with 2 other men around the same time. Still, in her mind, Mr. Griffin was the most likely father. She believed it strongly enough that she told him first. When she told him she was pregnant, she also told him she believed the child was his. Mr. Griffin did not deny it then. According to Miss Richmond, he came to her home, held the baby, lifted her up toward the light and said she could be his. That moment stayed with her, but after that the conversation stopped. There were no plans, no shared parenting, no consistent contact. The relationship between the adults faded, and the truth was buried under silence, fear, and shame. As for TAA, she grew up never knowing her father. Her mother did not give her a name. When people asked who her dad was, she said she didn't know. She said she didn't have one. As a child, she heard whispers from extended family members. When she was in elementary school, relatives commented that she looked like the Griffins. She didn't even know who that was. When she asked her mother, she was told those were not her people. Still, the comments stayed with her, forming cracks in the story she had been given. Growing up without a father's identity left deep emotional scars. TAA described her childhood as confusing and painful. She didn't know where she came from or who she resembled. She felt like a piece of her identity was missing. While other children could trace their roots and family traits, she had nothing but questions. Those unanswered questions followed her into adulthood. Years later, another layer of confusion emerged. Mr. Griffin's daughter from his marriage, Leisha, discovered paperwork related to child support. She found mail with TAA's name on it. Until then, she had only heard vague mentions that there might be another sister somewhere. Seeing that name made it real. Curious and unsettled, she searched for TAA online and reached out to her. When TAA received that message, she didn't know what to think. At first, she thought it might be a prank. Her mother had always denied the connection, But the message opened a door that could not be closed. Slowly, the truth began to surface, tangled with contradictions and half-answers. One of the most confusing parts of the story involved a DNA test from decades earlier. Miss Richmond claimed that when TAA was very young, a paternity test had been done in another state. She said she was told Mr. Griffin was not the father. Based on that, child support proceedings moved forward and then stalled. Mr. Griffin, however, said he received paperwork stating that he was the father. Two people remembered the same event in completely opposite ways. Records were missing. Agencies gave conflicting information. No one could clearly explain what had really happened. For TAA, this uncertainty became unbearable later in life, especially after a devastating personal loss. Her husband, a firefighter, died tragically while on duty. The day he died was the same day she had been invited to a family wedding on the Griffin side. She had considered going, but she didn't. After his death, she was overwhelmed with grief and guilt, replaying every decision that led up to that day. She began to feel that her unresolved past, her lack of family connection, made her grief even heavier. She realized she could not move forward without answers. She needed to know who her father was, not just biologically, but emotionally. She came to court not looking for money or revenge, but for truth. She wanted closure, something solid to hold onto after a lifetime of uncertainty. Mr. Griffin, on the other hand, said he had never doubted that TAA was his daughter. For 32 years, he believed it. He admitted he had not been present in her life. He said he came from a generation where people often avoided confronting painful truths, especially when doing so might disrupt existing families. He believed staying silent was the lesser evil, but silence had a cost, and TAA had paid it. When asked to speak directly to her, Mr. Griffin expressed regret. He apologized for not being there, for not stepping up, and for the pain she carried. His words were quiet, heavy with remorse, but they could not undo decades of absence. As the courtroom prepared for the DNA results, the emotional weight was undeniable. This was not just about biology. It was about identity, responsibility, and the consequences of choices made long ago. TAA stood there facing the man she had believed might be her father, bracing herself for an answer that would either confirm a lifelong belief or take it away forever. When the results were read, the truth finally came out. Mr. Griffin was not her biological father. 32 years of belief ended in a single sentence. The air seemed to leave the room. For TAA, the answer was devastating, even though it was also clarifying. For Mr. Griffin, it was a shock that forced him to confront the reality that his certainty had been wrong. Even then, he did not turn away from her. He offered to help her find the truth, to share names, to assist her in continuing the search for her real father. And in that moment, despite the pain, there was a strange sense of honesty that had never existed before. The truth did not heal everything. It did not give TAA back her childhood or erase the years of confusion, but it did give her something she had never had before: certainty. And sometimes, even painful certainty is better than a lifetime of doubt. The truth landed heavily, but it did not end the story. In many ways, it only opened another chapter. For TAA, hearing that Mr. Griffin was not her biological father did not suddenly erase the years of longing she had carried. If anything, it sharpened the pain. For decades, she had lived with an invisible question mark over her life, and now that question mark had been replaced with something just as difficult: a blank space. She had believed that this day would finally give her a name, a face, a history she could point to and say, "That's where I come from." Instead, she was left standing in the middle of the courtroom with the realization that the man she thought might be her father was not, and the real answer was still out there somewhere, unknown and unnamed. Mr. Griffin looked just as shaken. For more than 30 years, he had carried the belief that TAA was his daughter. Even though he had not been present in her life, that belief had shaped how he thought about the past. It was part of the story he told himself about his mistakes, his guilt, and his regrets. Now that belief was gone, replaced with a different kind of responsibility. Not the responsibility of fatherhood, but the responsibility of having played a role in a woman's pain by standing in the place of an answer that turned out not to be true. He spoke again, this time not as a man defending a claim, but as someone acknowledging harm. He said he knew his absence had affected her deeply. He admitted that even though the DNA showed he was not her father, he still felt accountable for the emotional damage caused by years of silence, secrecy, and avoidance. He told her that he wanted to help however he could, not out of obligation, but out of remorse. TAA listened, her emotions conflicted. Part of her was angry that she had spent so much of her life believing something that wasn't true, angry that the adults in her life had not been honest, not even with themselves, angry that even now, at 32 years old, she was still searching for the most basic truth about who she was. But beneath that anger was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying unanswered questions for too long. She spoke about what it felt like growing up without a father's name. She described how she had learned to stop asking questions because every question led to discomfort or silence. She talked about watching other children form relationships with their fathers, even imperfect ones, while she had nothing at all. No birthday calls, no guidance, no sense of belonging to a larger family story. She said it made her feel invisible. She also talked about how her husband's death had forced her to confront all of these unresolved feelings at once. Losing him had stripped away the one stable anchor in her life. In her grief, she realized that she could not keep running from her past. She needed to face it, even if the truth hurt. That was why she had come to court. Not because she expected an easy answer, but because she needed honesty, finally. The courtroom grew quiet as everyone absorbed her words. This was no longer just a legal matter. It was the story of how choices made decades earlier could echo through generations, shaping lives in ways that could never fully be undone. The judge acknowledged that reality. She spoke about how paternity cases are often about more than biology. They are about identity, connection, and closure. She emphasized that while the DNA results provided a scientific answer, they did not erase the emotional journey that brought everyone there. She reminded everyone that truth, even when painful, is necessary for healing. For TAA, the next step was unclear. She now knew who her father was not, but she still did not know who he was. Her mother had admitted long ago that there were other men during the time she became pregnant, but names had never been shared openly. Some of those men might not even be reachable anymore. Time had scattered people, memories, and records. Still, there was a strange sense of forward movement. For the first time in her life, TAA felt that she had the right to ask questions without being silenced. She felt justified in wanting answers. The shame that once surrounded her existence was no longer hers to carry. The truth had shifted the burden back where it belonged, onto the adults who had made those choices. As she left the courtroom, she did not feel relief, but she did feel lighter. The lie, or at least the uncertainty, had been confronted. She no longer had to wonder whether Mr. Griffin was her father. That chapter was closed, even if it ended painfully. The next chapter would be about reclaiming her story piece by piece on her own terms. Mr. Griffin also left changed. He was forced to face the reality that avoiding responsibility does not erase consequences. Even though he was not biologically connected to TAA, his actions had still shaped her life. He could not undo the past, but he could choose to be honest about it. He could choose to acknowledge the hurt rather than hide from it. In the end, there were no clear victories in that courtroom. No one walked away whole, but there was truth, and truth has a way of breaking cycles, even when it hurts. For TAA, the journey was not over, but at least now it was real. And for the first time, she was walking it with her eyes open, guided not by assumptions or silence, but by the courage to face whatever came next. The days after the courtroom felt strangely quiet for TAA. There was no dramatic sense of closure, no sudden peace. Instead, there was a stillness that came from finally knowing one truth, even though so many others remained unanswered. For most of her life, she had carried a question that never stopped echoing in her mind. Now that question had changed shape. It was no longer, "Is he my father?" but "Who am I really and where do I come from?" She returned to her daily life, but everything felt different. Conversations hit harder. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Moments from her childhood replayed in her mind with new meaning. She remembered the times she had felt out of place, the times she had watched other families interact and wondered why she felt like an outsider even when surrounded by people. She realized how deeply the absence of truth had shaped her sense of self. Her mother's role in all of this weighed heavily on her heart. She understood now that her mother had been young, reckless, and overwhelmed. She knew her mother had made mistakes, some driven by fear, some by shame, and some by a desire to protect herself from judgment. But understanding did not erase the hurt. TAA struggled with the idea that her life had been built on half-answers and avoidance. She wondered how different things might have been if honesty had come sooner. Still, she began to see something she had not seen before, the strength it took to survive without certainty. She had built a life, a family, and an identity without the foundation most people take for granted. She had learned resilience in the absence of guidance. She had learned empathy through loss. And she had learned that love, even when imperfect, could still shape her into someone capable of compassion. Her husband's memory remained close to her heart. His death had been the breaking point that forced her to seek the truth, but it was also the reminder that life could change in an instant. She often thought about how supportive he had been, how he had encouraged her to attend that wedding years earlier, believing she looked like she belonged with that family. Losing him left a void that no answer could ever fill, but it also reminded her that love did not require shared blood to be real. As time passed, TAA began to consider what family truly meant. She had spent so many years chasing a biological connection, believing it would somehow complete her. But now she understood that identity is built from many layers. Biology matters, but so do choices, presence, and care. The people who showed up for her, who loved her consistently, who stood by her through grief, had shaped her just as much as any DNA ever could. She also thought about Mr. Griffin often, not with bitterness but with a complicated mix of emotions. He was not her father, but he was still part of her story. His choices had influenced her life in profound ways. She appreciated that in the end he had not turned away from the truth. He had listened. He had apologized. He had acknowledged her pain. That did not erase the past, but it mattered. For Mr. Griffin, the aftermath of the test results brought its own reckoning. He had spent decades believing a story that allowed him to sit with his guilt in a certain way. Now that story was gone. He had to confront the reality that even mistaken beliefs could still cause harm when paired with inaction. He began to reflect on the choices he made as a younger man and how those choices had rippled outward, affecting not just his own family, but others as well. He realized that silence is not neutral. Silence can wound just as deeply as lies. By choosing not to confront the situation years ago, he had allowed confusion to grow and pain to deepen. He could not undo that, but he could carry the lesson forward. He could speak more honestly, take responsibility where it was due, and stop hiding behind the idea that avoiding conflict was the same as doing no harm. Back in her own space, TAA began to think about the future. She knew the search for her biological father might continue, or it might not. She was no longer sure she needed to chase every possible answer. What she needed now was peace. She wanted to stop defining herself by what she didn't know and start honoring what she had survived. She found herself thinking about her children and what this experience taught her about truth. She promised herself that she would never let silence steal their sense of identity. No matter how uncomfortable the truth might be, she wanted them to grow up knowing that honesty was an act of love. She wanted them to understand that their worth did not depend on perfection, but on authenticity. In quiet moments, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for the father she never knew, but for the childhood version of herself who had needed answers and never received them. She mourned the years spent wondering, the emotional energy poured into questions that adults should have answered long ago. That grief was heavy, but it was also cleansing. It allowed her to finally release the burden she had been carrying. The courtroom experience did not give her everything she hoped for, but it gave her something essential: validation. Her pain was real. Her questions were justified. Her journey mattered. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a problem to be avoided, but as a person deserving of truth and respect. As time moved forward, TAA began to feel a quiet strength settling within her. She no longer felt defined by the absence of a father's name. She felt defined by her resilience, her compassion, and her willingness to confront painful truths head-on. She understood now that identity is not something handed to you by others. It is something you claim for yourself. In the end, the story was never just about paternity. It was about accountability, honesty, and the long shadows cast by choices made in secrecy. It was about a woman who refused to let uncertainty define the rest of her life. And it was about the courage it takes to face the truth, even when that truth does not bring the comfort you hoped for. The answers did not heal everything, but they opened the door to healing. And sometimes, that is where real freedom begins. The courtroom was quiet, but the tension was heavy long before anyone spoke. Years of silence, regret, and unanswered questions had brought these people together. Mr. Griffin sat on one side, carrying the weight of a secret he had lived with for decades. Across from him stood TAA, a woman who had grown up without a father's name, without a clear sense of where she came from, and without the truth that could have anchored her life. Between them was a story that began long before either of them could understand its consequences. More than 30 years earlier, Mr. Griffin was a married man. He had been married for nearly a decade when he made a decision that would ripple through multiple families. He entered into a relationship with his wife's stepsister, Miss Richmond. It was not a brief mistake or a single lapse in judgment. It was a secret affair that lasted almost 2 years. They saw each other often, and they admitted to being intimate regularly. There was no protection, no real consideration of the consequences, only the reckless emotions of two people who admitted they were not thinking about anyone else at the time. Miss Richmond later became pregnant. She says that during that period, Mr. Griffin was the man she was with most. She also admitted that she had been intimate with 2 other men around the same time. Still, in her mind, Mr. Griffin was the most likely father. She believed it strongly enough that she told him first. When she told him she was pregnant, she also told him she believed the child was his. Mr. Griffin did not deny it then. According to Miss Richmond, he came to her home, held the baby, lifted her up toward the light, and said she could be his. That moment stayed with her, but after that the conversation stopped. There were no plans, no shared parenting, no consistent contact. The relationship between the adults faded, and the truth was buried under silence, fear, and shame. As for TAA, she grew up never knowing her father. Her mother did not give her a name. When people asked who her dad was, she said she didn't know. She said she didn't have one. As a child, she heard whispers from extended family members. When she was in elementary school, relatives commented that she looked like the Griffins. She didn't even know who that was. When she asked her mother, she was told those were not her people. Still, the comments stayed with her, forming cracks in the story she had been given. Growing up without a father's identity left deep emotional scars. TAA described her childhood as confusing and painful. She didn't know where she came from or who she resembled. She felt